This week in wrestling history, it's a big one this week. It's a very busy week. We begin 45 years ago this week on October 4th, 1975. The plane crash that nearly changed the course of wrestling history. Ric Flair, David Crockett, Bob Bruggers, Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, and Johnny Valentine, the father of Greg the Hammer Valentine, big star in his own right, we're all riding aboard the same twin-engine Cessna, heading from Charlotte to Wilmington, North Carolina for their next show because of the weight of all the wrestlers. The pilot, who was a 28-year-old Vietnam veteran, he made the decision to dump some fuel. He was going to empty some fuel from the gas tank to allow them to take off, but he did not distribute their weights evenly. That was the other mistake he made. Valentine noticed that they were out of gas. At some point during the flight, he looked over and said, "Hey, we're out of gas." And the pilot told him not to worry. The wing tanks are full. We're fine. But then they started to go down. And all of a sudden, they weren't so fine. And the pilot started to panic. He started screaming. Valentine slapped him right in the face to try to get him to come to his senses. He told people that had the pilot not panicked, he said, after the accident, he said, had the pilot not panicked, they could have landed that plane safely. Instead, they ended up crashing about 100 yards short of the runway. They narrowly missed running right into a water tower, which would have all but certainly killed everybody on board had that happened. Instead, they hit some trees and they nosedived into a railroad embankment. The pilot died from his injuries. 2 months later, he was in a coma. He never came out of it. Bruggers and Valentine both broke their backs, and they never wrestled again. Valentine was paralyzed and in a wheelchair for the rest of his life as a result of the crash. Flair broke his back in 3 different places. But he was able to get back in the ring. Less than a year later, he was already back in the ring. After just a period of months, Ric Flair, with a broken back in 3 places, was back in the ring wrestling. Flair was originally supposed to be sitting next to the pilot up front, not Johnny Valentine. Flair was up front at first. Valentine said that Flair was scared to be up there and he was whining about it. So finally Valentine had enough. He said, "Look, get in the back. I'll sit in the front." Just imagine how things would have been different. How differently things would have turned out if Flair would have stayed up in that front seat. 30 years ago, on October 2nd, 1990, in the small town of Ponoka, Alberta, Canada, famous at the time for its, local mental institution. That was its big claim to fame, according to Chris Jericho. A 19-year-old Chris Jericho made his in-ring debut against Lance Storm at the Moose Hall in front of 100 people. They wrestled to a 10-minute draw, and then they came back out at the end of the night, wrestled in a battle royal that Storm won. Jericho's payoff for that night was a cool $30. Or as wrestlers would probably say, gas money. 21 years ago this week, on October 3rd, 1999, came what at the time was the blockbuster announcement that head WWE writers Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara had left the company. They quit the company and they jumped ship to WCW. After a secret meeting with WCW management, both men were working without contracts at the time. Ferrara had gone to Vince McMahon before about wanting to sign a contract. That's how he had always done things before he came to wrestling, before he came to WWE. He wanted to sign a contract. He was told, well, that's not how things are done around here. So they were not tied down to any piece of paper. They played an instrumental role in the success of the WWE product during the Attitude Era, in collaboration, of course, with all the talent and the wrestlers themselves. Nobody can take that away from them. Nobody is denying the success that they enjoyed during those years. I cannot say the same thing for Russo's ideas post-WWE, but no doubt he had a hand in a lot of memorable moments on television while he was working for Vince McMahon. and their workload doubled with the addition of Smackdown. They already felt burned out. They were working nonstop. They were barely home. They were barely seeing their families. And they didn't even get a pay bump. When they added 2 hours of television with this SmackDown show, didn't even get a pay bump. It's like, here's 2 more hours of TV that we need you to write. So they wanted out. Russo told Wade Keller that he was making $350,000 a year at the time. And he said Vince McMahon always took care of him money-wise. You know, did he want to make more money? Of course, everybody wants to make more money. But it was never a case where Vince McMahon was, paying him peanuts or anything like that. He was being paid generously in the six figures. And again, he told Keller that at his peak, I guess, or at that time, he was making $350,000. And he went to Vince McMahon. He didn't have the guts to quit. But deep down, he was hoping to get fired. He kind of wanted to get fired, but he didn't want it bad enough where he was going to walk in and go, I quit. Or, hey, Vince, fuck you. And Vince would turn around and fire him. But that's what he wanted. That's what he says he wanted. He wanted Vince to fire him. He told him, I want $1 million a year, which he knew he would never get. And he told Vince, he goes, I want to move my family closer to where my wife's family lives because I'm working so many hours. I'm never home. I want them to move closer to her family. And one of the things, if not the thing, that sealed the deal for Russo in terms of his decision to leave was Vince McMahon's response to that request, which was that he said McMahon told him, Vince, you make enough money. Why don't you just hire a nanny? And that showed him that McMahon just didn't understand what he was going through. He didn't get it. That, and he and Ed Ferrara were also increasingly upset and bothered by the fact that whenever they would read an interview with Vince, like a magazine interview or something about the explosion of popularity of the WWF, it would always be Vince McMahon who would be taking, or like even behind the scenes, I guess, Vince McMahon would be taking credit for all of these different things. He would be the one taking credit for all of these ideas. And when he would do magazine interviews and he would cite somebody else, he would mention Shane. He would mention Shane McMahon and credit him as being a creative driving force, behind the scenes in the company. And that upset them because they were never given credit for their contributions publicly. So it was less of an issue, but it was still something that bothered the two of them. So Russo called up WCW. They flew him out to Atlanta right away. And within 48 hours, the deal was done. All while Vince McMahon was overseas with the roster in Europe. They had a Rebellion pay-per-view in Birmingham. And so that's where they weren't even on American soil. They were out of the country. When Russo decided to call WCW, he flew, he met with them, he did the deal. It was like in the dark of night, this deal was pulled off. So you can imagine when Vince McMahon landed back in the States and Russo called him on the phone to give him the news, he was none too happy. McMahon relied a lot on Russo and Ferrara to the point where, according to the two of them, there were times, back in those days, 99, where Vince wouldn't even look at the script. McMahon would not even look at the script for the show all the time. Because he trusted them that much. He's like, all right, let's just go with what's here. And the company at the time was just weeks away from going public. They were launching their IPO, I think it was 2 weeks later. All of a sudden, WWE just lost its top 2 writers. And they had this extra 2 hours of television every week that had to be written. Russo said he had already submitted his script for Raw that Monday. I don't know about SmackDown, but probably Raw and SmackDown. He didn't leave them in a lurch. He at least wrote, had the television already done and written for that week. It's funny. He mentioned that Raw show that Monday, which was the show that they wrote, was to have had Chris Jericho pinning The Rock in the main event. That was the only thing Russo claims when he watched the show that Vince McMahon changed. I guess he kept everything else that he had written, but the part about Jericho beating The Rock, he changed. Rock ended up beating Jericho instead. And when Russo was on Talk is Jericho, he told Chris, he goes, look, Chris, as big as you went on to become, bro, as big of a star as you went on to become, bro, If they would have gone with the finish that we wrote, bro, you would have gotten over 2 years earlier than you did if you would have beaten The Rock on that night, bro. So, Russo leaving turned out to be a game changer. Just not in the way that Russo probably expected. WWE went on to have, in my opinion, creatively, the best year that they have ever had in the year 2000. That's even with all of the McMahon overload on TV. And there was way too much McMahon on TV. And back then, more so than now, here we are 20 years later, there were still stories playing out with the McMahons that I guess, I don't even know if you can call it fresh even then, but it was kind of still fresh. But still, way too much McMahon influence on TV that year. Even with that, they lost their head writer. They lost their top star to injury when Steve Austin went down with the neck surgery. They were forced to build a whole bunch of new faces. And it was the best thing they could have done. Rock took the baton. Triple H came into his own as a headliner. Rikishi and Too Cool, they got over with their act. The Radicals came in, so that gave them a boost. With Eddie and Benoit and Malenko and Saturn. You had Kurt Angle coming into his own, one of the best rookie years that anybody has ever had. It's probably neck and neck with him and Brock Lesnar, as far as the best rookie year ever in WWE. Chris Jericho became a bigger star. Edge and Christian, the Hardys and the Dudleys, they came into their own, the whole TLC thing. So 2000 was a fantastic year for WWE. Not so much for WCW. And you can't lay all of that at Russo's feet. WCW was already on its way down even before he came in. But whatever magic touch he thought he had in WWE, we never got to see it in WCW. Now, a year before Russo left the company was one of those nights that I have to assume that he may have come up with himself, that I look back on as one of the most fun episodes of Monday Night Raw that I have ever watched. 22 years ago, on September 28th, 1998. The night after the Breakdown in Your House pay-per-view, where Stone Cold was pinned simultaneously by Kane and The Undertaker, and with no obvious winner, Vince McMahon ran off with the Smoking Skull belt. He held the title up. The next night on Raw, they brought back the Winged Eagle belt, albeit for one night only. It was just sitting in a glass case. They were going to present the championship to the new champion. Is it Undertaker? Is it Kane? I don't know. They're going to crown a new champion that night. When Stone Cold crashed the ceremony in a Zamboni. He drove a Zamboni to the ring and he rammed the ring. I mean, when I say he rammed the ring, he moved the ring. You could physically see the ring moving a couple of inches. So he rammed right into the side of the ring and he jumped off and clobbered Vince McMahon. I swear to you, the electricity in the building that night for this entire segment could have powered an entire stadium. That's how electric it was. I would have, as a fan, I would have killed to be in the building that night. Austin got let out in handcuffs, and when they came back, the madness continued. It didn't end there. This was Vince McMahon's very bad day. This had to be two of the hottest back-to-back segments they've ever done, like back-to-back like this, in the history of Monday Night Raw. Because as hot as that segment was and Austin got taken away, they came back from commercial. Vince McMahon was kind of getting his bearings. He had just been attacked. He's kind of getting his bearings back. He's back in the ring. It's just him and Kane and The Undertaker. And we still have to figure out who the champion is, right? We're not done yet. And Vince McMahon says, because I was assaulted by Stone Cold, he chewed Undertaker and Kane out for not living up to their end of the deal, I guess, and taking Austin out and protecting him. So you didn't live up to your end of the deal. I'm not going to live up to mine. And instead of announcing a new champion, he said, I'm going to make you fight for it. He goes, at the next pay-per-view, Judgment Day, it's going to be Kane and The Undertaker one-on-one to crown a new WWF champion, and Stone Cold Steve Austin is going to be the guest referee for the match. And then he looked at the two of them, and he said, it's like dealing with the handicapped. And he looked at Kane, and he said, one's physical. And he looked over at The Undertaker, and he said, and the other is mental. And he said, good luck to you both. And he went to go walk off, and Undertaker said, I don't think so. He grabbed Vince by the shoulder. He took the microphone. And the Undertaker, just great line, just great dialogue here. Undertaker, he takes the mic and he says, if you ever get out of line with either one of us, you're going to be the one handicapped. And that I will promise. And he shoved the mic back into Vince's chest. And they kind of separated. Nobody left the ring, but like Undertaker and Kane kind of looked in the other direction. Vince threw the microphone down, and with their backs turned to Vince McMahon, Vince decided he's going to flip the both of them off. So he flipped them, or he went to go flip them the double bird. As he's flipping them the double bird, Undertaker turns around, and he catches Vince in the act. And I think Jim Ross on commentary said, uh-oh. And that was it. Undertaker nailed Vince. He's beating the shit out of him. Kane starts stomping him. Kane and Undertaker are stomping Vince. The place is going nuts all over again. Jerry Lawler is freaking out. Call 911. Undertaker has like a grapevine or a leg vice on Vince's his leg, his knee. Jim Ross is losing his mind. He's ripping, he's tearing. And this all ended with them dragging Vince outside the ring. They picked up the ring steps and they placed his ankle on top of the bottom part of the steps, and they smashed his ankle with the ring steps. And he sold it like he, had a broken ankle. Which is what ended up giving us, because they took him to the hospital, it's what ended up giving us another classic segment the following week with Dr. Austin whacking him over the head in the hospital with a bedpan. And then the week after that is when Austin filled up McMahon's Corvette with cement. I was at that show. That was at the Nassau Coliseum. And then after the show that night, I was annoying Droz and Road Warrior Animal in the lobby of the Marriott Hotel right next door. As they were trying to go into the hotel bar, I think they put their shit away upstairs. They came down. A lot of the wrestlers were filing into the bar. I was too young to get into the bar. I was just young enough I wasn't allowed into the bar. But I'd say it was probably me and about half a dozen other little teenage brats are bothering these two. They were cool about it, though. They were cool about it. 15 years ago, on October 1st, 2005... wrestling fans were treated to a dream match in Ring of Honor when Samoa Joe battled Pro Wrestling Noah's Kenta Kobashi for the very first time ever inside the Grand Ballroom of the New Yorker Hotel. The last time Ring of Honor ran the New Yorker Hotel was my first live Ring of Honor show. Less than a year after this. Yeah, I think my first live show was less than a year after this. And I'm sorry it wasn't this show. I'm very sorry I didn't have a chance to be at this show. The crowd was legendary that night. The match was legendary. The crowd was legendary. Maybe the best match to this day in Ring of Honor history. There's a lot of people who would say that. A lot of people who were there that night, but even the people who weren't would say this is probably the best match in Ring of Honor history, going all the way back to 2002. No titles on the line, just a special attraction. And Kobashi was very hesitant to even do it because he was worried about what kind of reaction he would get coming to the States. Joe told Steve Austin on his podcast a number of years ago that Kobashi was worried about coming in and getting the kind of reaction that somebody like Mr. Fuji would get here in the States, figuring, oh, he's the bad guy, he's the evil foreigner, he's going to get booed and mocked and made fun of. He didn't understand how adored he was by those Ring of Honor fans. Those are the fans who read the newsletters and they traded tapes and they knew who Kobashi was, right? They knew Kobashi, they knew Misawa, and they had a tremendous amount of respect for those two, but he didn't know that. He didn't realize that. And when he walked out, he realized very quickly, based on the reaction he got, wow, these people love me. These people respect me. And they had an epic battle. Kobashi got his hand raised. Think about this. In the span of less than 1 month, Samoa Joe wrestled what a lot of people still consider to be the greatest match in TNA history. At their Unbreakable pay-per-view, that was the triple threat main event against Chris Daniels and AJ Styles. And then a few weeks later, maybe the greatest match in Ring of Honor history against Kobashi. Joe was on fire that year. If WWE had taken an interest in Samoa Joe earlier than they did, because back then, and even when he was, in TNA, they took one look at him and said, we're not interested in him, because at that time, he didn't look like the kind of wrestler that they were looking for and they were interested in. But imagine if they had taken an interest in Joe back then, all those many years ago, when they had people like CM Punk floating around in developmental. What if they had taken an interest back then in Samoa Joe? I'll tell you one thing that I know, he would have had a lot more success in that company than he has so far. He's carved himself a nice little gig out right now doing commentary, and he's had some pay-per-view main events. I'm not going to say Joe has been completely mistreated or anything like that. Joe's also had a problem in recent years of staying healthy. As he's gotten older, his body, he's taken a lot of abuse. And Samoa Joe, talking about Tegan Knox before, but Samoa Joe, thankfully no ACL tears, but he's taken a lot of abuse and he's suffered a lot of injuries. So we haven't really seen the version of Samoa Joe in WWE that a lot of people remember from those days in Ring of Honor and TNA. And it's a shame because he should have been a star on the level of a CM Punk or a Daniel Bryan who got over and became big stars and they were world champion. That should have been Samoa Joe in WWE. And we never got to see it. But what if? What if they would have taken an interest in him 10 years earlier than they did? 2 days later, on October 3rd, 2005, WWE returned to USA Network after 5 years on Spike TV with their big homecoming episode of Monday Night Raw, which featured a 30-minute Iron Man match between Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels. They fought to a time limit draw. Michaels challenged him to sudden death. Kurt just walked to the back. Edge beat Matt Hardy in a loser leaves Raw ladder match, ending their feud. God, Matt came out looking like such a loser in that feud. Eric Bischoff got himself a WWE Championship match against John Cena. And I'll give you one guess as to who won. Stone Cold Steve Austin. He made a special appearance that night. He gave stunners to all 4 members of the McMahon family, including one of the absolute worst stunners that I have ever seen anybody take. Courtesy of Linda McMahon. She didn't even take the stunner. She sort of pushed herself away as she fell down. I'll tell you this much. It was not as bad as the worst stunner that I have ever seen. And the worst stunner that I have ever seen was taken by her husband on a random episode of Monday Night Raw back in 2001. This was during the Alliance period. So I want to say somewhere maybe around October. It might have been the night that Kurt Angle went heel and joined the Alliance. Now, he ended up being a mole for WWE. But it might have been the night that I think Angle turned heel and was whacking everybody in the head with chairs. There's bodies everywhere. Austin picks up McMahon. I know what it was. I think Vince had a match that night with Shane. Austin picks up Vince McMahon, who's exhausted after the match and everything that's gone down. And he gave him a kick to the gut. And he went to go give him a stunner, but Vince fell too soon. He fell early. And Austin ended up going down for the move anyway. It looked absolutely atrocious. Just atrocious. So I don't want to hear that Linda McMahon took the worst stunner ever. The worst stunner ever still belongs, in my opinion, to Vince McMahon on that episode. Even that ghost stunner that Tim White, the referee, took on Sunday Night Heat many years ago, that's just fucking hilarious. That wasn't even as bad. You got to find that Vince stunner. There's absolutely nothing worse than that Vince McMahon stunner. Now, Mean Gene Okerlund, he did an interview later on in this homecoming show. They were obviously pressed for time because they rushed the shit out of this. They had Hulk Hogan come out. Old school Hulk Hogan. Well, let me tell you something, Mean Gene promo. The two of them in the ring together. And this was maybe a 2-minute segment before they ended it. But Hogan came out and he asked the fans, what would happen? He posed the scenario. What would happen if the Hulkster were to one day step into the ring with the Texas Rattlesnake? And the place went nuts. Now, there were rumors at that time that WWE was trying to put together a Hogan versus Austin match for WrestleMania 22 in Chicago. And imagine that match in front of a Chicago crowd. Imagine that. The problem is, nobody bothered to tell Austin about any of this. In fact, I think he may have already left the building after his segment was over. He may have already left. He didn't stick around, I don't think, to see the Hogan segment. I think he may have found out about it after the fact. But either way, that's not even relevant. The fact is, he didn't know that Hogan was coming out and basically cutting a promo, teasing a match. That's exactly what they wanted the fans to think. They wanted the fans to think, oh my God, we're going to get a WrestleMania match. This is the first little seed being planted. We're going to get to see Hogan against Austin, the two biggest stars of all time, one-on-one together in a match at WrestleMania. That's exactly what they wanted people to think. That's exactly what they wanted people to get excited about. Austin was pissed because nobody told him about this, and he had no interest in wrestling Hulk Hogan. He had already retired, so physically, maybe in his mind, he just felt he couldn't do it, but he was not enamored with the idea of wrestling Hogan, and he had said years later, he just thought the match would be the shits. And it was very important to him that if he were to ever come back and get back in the ring, especially after a long layoff like that he didn't want to come back and have a shitty match. So the match never did happen, and he regrets that. He regrets that he and Hogan now, looking back on it, never had the chance to get in the ring together. I put that more on Austin because Austin, I think, had multiple opportunities to make the match happen. It was his choice not to do it. And maybe he's right. Maybe the match would have been shit. Maybe it wouldn't have been as good as Hogan and Rock. It would have had to be smoke and mirrors. I mean, they weren't going to go out there and have this, knockdown, drag-out type match, but again, it would have been similar to Hogan Rock in that it doesn't have to be a technical masterpiece. You've got these two guys who can they can make people lose their minds just based on who they are. You don't even need to do much. That match would have been gigantic. I think even then, even in 2006, that match would have been gigantic. But we never got it. Play it in the video game if you want to know what the outcome of that match would be. 13 years ago this week, on October 1st, 2007, we got a first-time ever match on Monday Night Raw between John Cena and Mr. Kennedy. 6 days before John Cena was to have defended the WWE title against Randy Orton at No Mercy in a last man standing match, that match ended up not taking place. When about a minute or so into this match here, maybe not even a minute, between Cena and Kennedy, John Cena gave Kennedy a hip toss. And on a hip toss, John Cena tore his pectoral muscle. I think it was his right pectoral muscle. And you could tell the moment it happened. If you go back and watch the beginning of that match, you could see exactly where the injury happened. To Cena's credit, or his stupidity, he finished the match with a torn pec. And it was a pretty severe tear. He finished the match, he wrestled a few more minutes, he beat Kennedy, and then he took not one but two RKOs from Randy Orton, one in the ring when Orton immediately came into the ring when the match ended, and he hit him with an RKO, and then also on the announce desk. So I'm sure for Cena that didn't feel too good. I'm sure Orton had no idea. Orton probably had no idea that Cena was even hurt. So Cena ended up being stripped of the title. And that ended his reign as champion. He had been champion for 380 days, over 1 year. As WWE champion, that was at that time, that was the longest WWE title run since Hulk Hogan had his big 4-year run with the belt back in the 80s. Now, CM Punk later on went on to be champion for 434 days, but this predates the CM Punk run. So Vince McMahon, they get to No Mercy 6 days later. They open the pay-per-view, and Vince McMahon opens the show by handing the championship over to Randy Orton and crowning him as the new WWE champion. He then had a match with Triple H. That was the opening match, and Orton immediately lost the belt to Triple H. So we went from John Cena as the champion to Randy Orton being handed the belt to Randy Orton posting himself in the corner and being rolled up and pinned, and now Triple H is the champion. Triple H had another match. He beat Umaga, and then they came back in the main event. It was Triple H and Orton in a last man standing match. And that's when Orton won the belt back. So you talk about playing hot potato with the title. They played hot potato with the title in one night. We were told John Cena would miss anywhere from 6 months to a year with the injury. He was back in 3.5 months. That's when he made his surprise return in the Royal Rumble match in 2008. Madison Square Garden, came out in the number 30 spot. I can tell you from being there live, as hated as Cena was in those days, and in New York it was no different. It's one of those markets where you would expect that he would be booed out of the building. When his music hit and he walked out, the place went apeshit. They forgot. They forgot they were supposed to hate this guy, and they lost their minds. And it was a great moment. It was a genuine surprise. Because nobody was expecting him back. But as soon as he got into the ring and the music ended, it's as if everybody just said, oh shit, we're supposed to hate this guy. And they started booing him again. But whether they want to admit it or not, there were a lot of grown men marking the hell out in the building that night for John Cena. And it was 1 year ago this week, on October 2nd, 2019, that pro wrestling returned live to TNT for the first time in almost 20 years, since the WCW Monday Nitro days. It was the premiere of AEW Dynamite, running head-to-head with NXT on USA, which had Adam Cole beating Matt Riddle to retain the NXT Championship, Shayna Baszler successfully defending her NXT Women's title against Candice LeRae, and Finn Balor making his return to NXT. Meanwhile, over on Dynamite, Cody beat Sammy Guevara, Nyla Rose won the women's title from Riho, and Chris Jericho, Santana, and Ortiz beat the Elite in a six-man tag, which ended with the debut of Jake Hager and the formation of the Inner Circle. The Young Bucks have since revealed that the original plan that they had in mind for that first episode of Dynamite was to hold the show at Madison Square Garden. I don't know if they would have been able to pull that off or not, but that was their idea. They would have Dynamite live from MSG. And there's no doubt in my mind they would have sold out. Big show like that, premiere, live, TNT, New York being a big wrestling market, easily they would have sold that show out. And so they would have run the Garden, and it would have ended with AJ Styles, Luke Gallows, and Carl Anderson debuting for a Bullet Club reunion. I guess maybe the Bullet Club would have they would have turned on them and left them laying, but that was their original idea. Before AJ decided to take the money that WWE was offering him and stay, and Anderson and Gallows followed suit and ended up doing the same. But the significance cannot be, you cannot really discount the significance of Dynamite premiering on TNT. Even if you're not an AEW fan, you're just being naive if you don't think that Dynamite debuting a year ago this week was a game-changing event in the wrestling business. Yes, wrestling is not booming again. Head-to-head, they're pulling in 5 million viewers in a single night. Most weeks, it's a struggle for NXT and AEW to combine for 1.5 million. That is true. Those days that people remember of 5, 6, 7 million people watching wrestling in a single night, those days are over. Those days, they ain't ever coming back. Those days are in the rearview mirror. The interest level in wrestling today is not what it was 20 years ago. It's not. But having an alternative for fans, having an alternative for wrestlers, and when I say alternative, it's not as if the AEW product is radically different from what you see on WWE television. You have a mix of great wrestling with some silly gimmicks and comedy stuff. Like it's all there in terms of that sort of thing. I tend to think that what AEW, in terms of them putting their show together every week, Dynamite is a much more consistently enjoyable show than Raw or Smackdown. Smackdown could have 2 weeks in a row of just great television and then be absolute dog shit for the next 3. Raw is dog shit on a lot of weeks, way more than it should, given the talent that they have. And it's maddening because there's no reason for it. NXT generally is still a good show. It doesn't have the same kind of life and energy that they had when they had fans in the building at Full Sail. Nothing you can really do about that right now. But NXT continues to be a consistently good show. Some weeks it's very good. But you have an alternative now. If you are sick of WWE, if you don't like WWE, all of a sudden you have this new wrestling league that just popped up. And it has some new faces, and it has some faces that you would know who came from WWE, like Chris Jericho, and now they have Brody Lee and Jake Hager, and all Dustin Rhodes and Cody, and all these people that you used to be able to see over there. Yeah, they have a lot of that here too. But there's also a lot of talent that you never would have even known about. You have an alternative. If you don't like one, maybe you'll like the other. And for the wrestlers, it's fantastic because now they have another place to go that seemingly pays pretty damn well. It's not like they pay peanuts. And if you have a big enough name, you can make a very nice living for yourself working in AEW and have the benefit, possibly, of being able to work dates outside the company, as a lot of those people do. You don't have that freedom and luxury in WWE. You're locked into a contract, and they're your master. You serve them. And that's how it works. So, regardless of whether or not you like AEW, this was a game-changing event for all of those reasons. Especially for the talent. It gives them another place to go. I guarantee, I don't even know the exact number, but there already in the last year have been so many wrestlers, and Randy Orton admitted that he did this. But he's not the only one. A lot of wrestlers who teased that they might go to AEW, maybe they even had a conversation with AEW and Tony Khan and the Bucks, but they only did it to get more leverage so they can get more money out of WWE. Why do you think Anderson and Gallows got contracts for $750,000 a year each? You think they would have gotten contracts of that size if AEW wasn't a thing? Or some of the other guys that got big money deals, you think WWE would have given them that kind of money without AEW being around? You're out of your fucking mind. So there's a lot of reasons why having this new wrestling company sprout up and get the kind of slot they did on TNT was a hugely positive thing for the wrestling business. Even if you just despise AEW, you hate the product, you don't like it, you don't like Cody or the Bucks or whatever your excuse is, that's fine. But this was something that the wrestling industry needed for a very long time. They needed somebody to try to step into that number 2 spot. Impact kind of flirted with it a number of years ago when they were pulling 2 million fans a week on TV for all of a few weeks. There was some promise there. Unfortunately, they crashed and burned. And they've had to reinvent themselves a whole bunch of times. And they have a good product now, and they have a lot of talent there. Impact is still around, but there's no buzz. There's no buzz. Very few people watch. Nobody talks about them anymore the way they used to. Ring of Honor, good product, but nobody really talks about them. It's all about visibility. They got tremendous visibility when they got that deal on TNT. And it was 2 days later, on October 4th, 2019, Smackdown made the move to Fox. This was WWE's return to network television for the first time since the early Smackdown days on UPN. This marked the end of Kofi Kingston's 6-month run as a WWE champion. He lost to Brock Lesnar in 8 seconds. He went down to a single F5. That was the only move of the match. And then we had former UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez coming on out with Rey Mysterio, making his WWE debut, taking down Brock, the man that he beat in the UFC. And that set up their one-and-done match a few weeks later in Saudi Arabia. It went 2 minutes, Brock beat him, and that was it. We never really saw him again after that. WWE had signed Velasquez to a multi-year contract, but then they cut him. They released him in the wave of COVID cuts back in April. So it's going to be a very short video package when Cain Velasquez is eventually inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. You're not going to have a lot of footage. So you got to make the most of those highlights from SmackDown when he walked out, and then Saudi, maybe a couple of Raw appearances. What a career. What a career that Cain Velasquez had for himself.